We're here in the We Create Centre in Cloughjordan Eco Village, and the event is a Macra Na Feirme discussion. I'm here with Ray Bates, who is an adjunct professor in UCD. So,
That's right.
Ray, can you tell us what you're here to talk about today?
Well, I was invited by Macra, and it's an event sponsored jointly with the European Parliament office in Dublin to talk about the current situation in climate change. So that's what I've been asked to do.
And could you give us a brief on what you expect to say today?
Well, my job as a scientist is to try to present an objective picture of what's happening, and it's not my job to be an advocate for either side in the debate about climate change or climate action. The scientists have to be completely objective and tell the public and the policymakers the situation as science sees it. So the decisions that follow from that are political decisions, and it's not my job to guide policy in any particular direction, but just to tell what the science tells us. Warming has been observed, global warming has been observed over the past century. It's about 0.85 of a degree Celsius. You were mentioning the Maynooth conference there, and just to take one of the memorable statements that I heard from the Maynooth conference. I wasn't actually there, but it was live streamed and I saw part of it. And towards the end, the concluding part, it said that the Irish equivalent of leaving fossil fuels in the ground is to cut back agricultural emissions. And that implies that Irish agricultural emissions have to be cut back by 2/3. We are a country that has large emissions per head of the population, but we have low emissions per unit of output of dairy products and beef in our agricultural sector. A conflicting situation, our emissions per head of the population are very high, but our emissions per unit of output in the dairy sector and the beef sector are very low. And we're a food exporting country on a major scale. 90% of our food output is exported. So if we were to follow the idea, the parallel of leaving fossil fuels in the ground, is the Irish equivalent is cutting back agricultural emissions by 2/3. That means that the Irish beef and dairy sector will basically have to be closed down to a large degree because they are responsible for a very large amount of Irish emissions.
Yeah.
And that means that Ireland would cease to be a food exporting country on the scale that it now is.
Yeah.
Now, is that a politically acceptable consequence for Ireland or not? This is a political.
Yeah.
It's a political question.
Yeah.
To be decided.
So, for example, would it make sense in the context of beef and dairy being so heavy emitters of greenhouse gases for us to change the type of food we produce, to move more over into foods that are
into tillage and that
into tillage, into horticulture, into value adding in those sectors, because making beef and dairy more efficient is like making cars more efficient in a context where trains exist, or buses exist, or walking exists. It's very difficult to get the improvements we need in dairy and beef because it takes an awful lot of energy to produce dairy and beef, and there's an awful lot of emissions.
And water.
Water, and even methane from grass-fed.
Mm-hmm.
So and methane is more potent in the short term. So it's very difficult to make meat and milk make sense in a context of having to radically reduce global warming. So maybe we should change the agri-food that we do to deal with the fact that the rest of the world will probably start not consuming meat and milk in a context of having to adjust to climate change on the scale they currently consume.
Well, at the present time, there is an increasing demand for Irish exports in the beef and dairy sector on the world scale, and we don't really have much control over that. China is an expanding market, and if we decide voluntarily to cut back our emissions in a major way, it would involve a lot of economic sacrifices for this country. We could possibly think of going over to tillage. Now, I'm not an expert in the agricultural area, but I have heard agricultural experts say that if land that is presently used for grass and dairy and beef production, etc., If it were not used for that purpose, it might not be economically feasible to use the land at all. It might just fall out of use. This is what I've heard agricultural experts say.
Or certainly go into a change of use, such as forestry.
Yeah, it could go into forestry, but that would mean that it would have severe, I mean, I'm talking politics now, not science here, you know. It would have severe economic implications for this country. I mean, after the crash in 2008, we had 250,000 people emigrate from this country, largely to Australia. Do we want to take actions that would cause a repeat of something like that? I mean, these are political questions.
Yeah, well, I suppose maybe it's worth exploring how a change to tillage and to horticulture, and possibly also to organic farming, for example, which is more labour intensive, more mixed farming systems, more crop rotation, some of which were actually in the original CAP idea for CAP reform in 2011, but which were dropped subsequently. It could be possible to have more labour intensive farming, which actually has a lower carbon footprint if we put the research into that area.
Yeah. Well, as I say, these are political questions, but at the moment anyway, our beef and dairy sector is extremely important for Ireland in terms of export, in terms of employment, not only on the land but downstream as well. So to take a decision to get out of it would be a very, it would have huge economic consequences for the country and for its people. And it could possibly lead to a large increase in emigration. It's difficult to predict what would happen with a change in agriculture, but the other types of agriculture could be seen to be quite labour intensive. Whether there's markets for that food is one of the questions, but I suppose in a climate change context, perhaps the rest of the world will look on high intensity carbon foods as the equivalent of, for example, smoking cigarettes now, that it will become taboo in a sense in a context of climate change to actually consume foods that are so dense in terms of their effect on climate change. Right. Well, of course, it's a world issue. If China decides it wants to buy Irish dairy and beef products, do we say, no, we're not selling it? This is a political question. But to come back to climate change in Ireland, as I mentioned, the temperature change in Ireland from the 1940s to now is 1/4 degree Celsius. And it's not a major change.
So did you say earlier there was 2 phases of temperature increase?
Yeah, in the early part of the century, from 1910 to 1945, there was a period of very rapid warming. Then there was a 25-year period of cooling. And in the latter part of the century, from 1970 to 1998, again, there was a period of rapid warming.
The total being about 7.85.
But, speaking as a scientist, I have to be objective here. The warming that occurred in the early part of the century, when emissions were small, was as big as the warming that occurred in the later part of the century, when emissions were large. So the position is very complicated. There's natural variability and other factors going on in the background as well. So at this stage in Ireland, there hasn't been major climate change in the sense of 1/4 degree from the 1940s to now is not a major change.
No, but obviously 0.75 or 0.85 of a degree from 1900 to now
that is a significant change.
So it's almost like when you take the time snap defines the position, but certainly the basic trend is obvious globally and nationally, and you would agree that the basic trend is towards the climate increasing, the temperature increasing.
The temperature is increasing. Now the question is, when would we reach a 2-degree warming?
And so just before we go there, do you think there's any concerns about 1.5 degrees, for example? Is everything rosy up until 2 degrees?
No, I mean, a 1.5 degree warming is a significant amount of warming. But the ocean temperature, the ocean covers 70% of the globe. And the ocean surface temperature, the globally averaged ocean surface temperature, is the main thing that you have to look at as a scientist. And the increase in the globally averaged sea surface temperature from the 1940s to the present is 1/3 degree Celsius. So over 70 years, it's increased by 1/3 degree. That is not a major change.
Okay, but then presumably, based on the Irish figures you mentioned earlier, in a slightly longer time frame, you've probably seen a slightly higher increase again.
Well, the Irish temperature from the 1940s to the present has gone up by a quarter of a degree.
Yeah, but from 1900 it's gone up by 0.85.
But
yeah.
most of that, as much of that warming occurred prior to 1950 has occurred from 1950 to now. So there were two periods.
Yeah, certainly periods after the Industrial Revolution, after massive increase in human activity on the planet. So the increase in the ocean temperature then from 1900 to now would probably also be about 0.85.
It's about 0.85 as well.
So it could be argued that this 30-year time snap in the middle is irrelevant in terms of the long history we've had on planet Earth and the 150 odd years of climate temperature increasing. So is it not the case that we're already seeing severe effects from the increase we've had?
Not in Ireland, no.
No, not in Ireland, no.
No.
But certainly in the world, in the poorest parts of the world where people are least able to cope.
I'm not an expert on the climate of Africa, so I really can't say anything very definitive about it. People have been there and they've seen changes, but there is a lot of natural variability, of course, that you get periods of drought and years later you get periods when rain goes back to normal, etc. So,
but coastal communities, for example, in Senegal, in El Salvador, certainly are chronicling increases in the sea level rises, which increases the salt water that pushes into the land, which makes it difficult for people to live coastally, for example.
Yeah, well, the rate of sea level rise at the moment is 3.2 millimeters per year, which is 30 centimeters per century. So that and there have the rate of rise over the past half century is about the same as it was during the previous half century, according to scientific studies of the subject. So while it's something to worry about, it's not a planetary emergency in the sense that it's not accelerating during the period of satellite observations. It's been steady at 3.2 millimeters per year. And this rate has been observed before in earlier parts of the 20th century. So the question is, when you're talking about climate action, you have to consider the question, is the situation that we're looking at a planetary emergency or is it a longer term threat? If it's a planetary emergency, we have to take every possible action regardless of cost to counter it, because a planetary emergency, obviously, there is nothing that should not be done to cut back emissions if we're facing a planetary emergency. If, on the other hand, we're facing a long-term threat, then we can also consider our national interests as well as our global obligations. And a lot of people in Ireland would hold that our national interests involve agriculture and food exports, such as we have at the moment.
So maybe there's 2 points there then that we could follow up on. As a very open exporting, agri-food exporting economy, is it risky to take succor from the fact that we're not getting much of an effect from climate change, but our global neighbours are? Surely that will mean that they'll be in chaos to some extent, that they'll find it very difficult to import food from places like Ireland if they're having food riots and if they're having sea level rises of an extreme level. Is it not very dangerous for an agri-food exporting economy to, in a sense, ignore climate change happening in other parts of the world? And then the second question, well, we'll do that one first.
Well, as I say, there are climate variations which have severe effect. There have been famines in parts of Africa at different times. In the Sahel region of West Africa in the 1970s, there was severe drought and great dislocation. But at the moment there isn't. The rainfall came back again, and in East Africa we've had a lot of droughts and famines. These are drastic situations when people are suffering terribly. Now, the question of whether they're due to our greenhouse gas emissions is a question on which science has not pronounced for definite.
But it seems very likely that greenhouse gas is influencing negatively droughts, severe weather, and so on, and they're affecting globally more than Ireland, as you said yourself. So is it wise or prudent to be hoping that we can keep exporting to places that will be in such trouble when they may have to relocalise their food production, or where they may have lots of very awkward things to deal with, and they may not want to or be able to afford to import beef from Ireland, for example?
Well, countries like China this is where most of the demand is coming from for our food exports. It's expanding countries like China. So I can't really say anything very authoritative about the climate of Africa because I'm not an expert in that. My area of expertise is global climate sensitivity.
So would you actually be worried then about, for example, potential unexpected but possible effects such as the permafrost melting and unexpected knock-on effects of small increases in temperature, which could have drastic effects on methane release, for example? I mean, there are definitely fears about...
There are fears about this.
And could you expand upon that?
There are fears, and particularly over places like Siberia and Alaska, about methane emissions increasing. And this is a fear of something that might happen. But as of now, there hasn't been an observed major increase in methane emissions over either Siberia or Alaska.
Okay, and are there any other major potential shocks that you're aware of which we need to be cognizant of, even in the context of short, small increases in temperature?
Well, these are often discussed in terms of tipping points.
Yeah.
And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has 3 separate working groups, and the working group 1 is the physical scientists' contribution to the overall IPCC report, and they didn't in the last report indicate any tipping points within this century.
Okay.
So this is the IPCC. It's not my personal view.
Yeah.
I try to, as I say, I don't want to give any personal opinions.
Yeah.
Except in the political area. If you ask me a political question, that would be a personal opinion.
Yeah.
But if I speak in the science area, I am, as a scientist is not allowed to give personal opinions if he is speaking as a scientist.
Yeah.
He has to tell what the actual situation is. And the body politic, the public policymakers, etc., make political decisions based on the scientific evidence provided. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been given strict instructions that their job is to provide objective scientific evidence, and they are forbidden to be advocates in the political sphere. That's not their job.
Okay.
They're actually forbidden to do it.
And as a citizen, do you fear any tipping points?
Well, the methane release in the longer term, if global warming turns out to accelerate, and if the model predictions for the future, say of 4 degrees by the end of the century, did materialize, then you would have to worry a lot. I mean, 4 degrees is a very large amount. So if you go on climate model projections, you would have to be very worried about what might happen for the future.
So, Ray Bates, then, just to finish up, science has to be cautious and just use evidence. And at the same time, then we have this principle called the precautionary principle, whereby sometimes certain products, for example, are banned from use in case things go wrong in the future based on a certain amount of evidence, but not a huge amount of evidence.
Right.
So how do you, considering the catastrophe that would happen with 4 degrees warming, would it not be prudent to be thinking precautionarily as well as just based on the immediate evidence?
Well, let's look at it first of all from the scientist's point of view and then from the citizen's point of view. From the scientist's point of view, the predictions of 4 degrees are based on climate models. So you have to ask the question, how reliable is a climate model projection? And during the past 15 years, the models have been overestimating the rate of warming. So if you depend on the model projections going further into the future, there is a possibility, we don't know really how reliable climate models are. They give us an indication of what might happen and they tell us what we might have to worry about. But they haven't been able to predict things like the fact that the Antarctic sea ice has expanded in recent decades, whereas the Arctic ice has declined. So according to the models, the ice should have been receding in both hemispheres, but it isn't. It's expanding in the southern hemisphere. And the models have not been able to predict that. They've failed to do it. And the rate of warming that they've projected over the past 15 years has been an overestimate by comparison with what's actually been observed. So speaking from purely as a scientist, I would view climate models with a degree of caution. And I've worked as a specialist in this area. Now, if you speak as a citizen...
so just on that, caution and precaution sound very similar as concepts. So you speak with caution and you think they might be getting it wrong, but if they're getting it right, surely the precautionary principle, which is also a principle of science, should be making us think more carefully about potential problems.
Well, if you, as a citizen, if you think we're in a planetary emergency situation, then obviously no cost can be spared. We cannot think of costs. We just have to think of every conceivable action that has to be taken if we're in a planetary emergency. Now, speaking from my perspective as a scientist, I don't see us as being in a planetary emergency of a kind that would dictate abandoning all national interests at the present time. I don't see it as being in that situation. There's a definite threat of something serious, but I don't see it from my perspective as being a planetary emergency currently.